We were here, right? Is this where we were?
Yeah.
We're talking about reptiles, because we already briefly mentioned amphibians, right? As much as I'm going
I think we ended on the egg.
on the egg. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So really fast, historically the class Reptilia would have had 4 orders, right? Chelonia, which would be turtles and tortoises. Squamate, which would be snakes and lizards, right? Crocodilia, which would be alligators, crocodiles, and caiman. And then Rhicocephalia, which is this weird little order that has this thing called a tuatara. It's like a weird little kind of iguana-looking thing with a parietal eye. And then there are about 12 orders of extinct reptiles, which would have included all the dinosaurs. The problem is, we now know that birds, phylogenetically, are reptiles. I'm going to show you that in a second. And birds, in and of itself, has 27 different orders. So exactly where birds are going to come in here, whether that's going to be some kind of a subclass inside of the class Reptilia, or whether they're just going to get rid of these Linnaean ranks altogether, that's all still up in the air. So this definition, or these characteristics I'm going to give you for Reptilia, are a little bit expanded now, because of course we're including birds. Birds are going to be part of this somehow. So reptiles, including birds, and mammals belong to this group that we call amniotes. And these are the fully terrestrialized vertebrates, the only ones. If you remember, amphibians, even though they're considered terrestrial vertebrates, their reproductive life history is still tied to water. The vast majority of them still have external fertilization, which means that they're releasing sperm into the environment. Sperm don't swim, so they have to be having sex in water, not to mention the fact that juveniles are aquatic, that they have gills and things like that. So they really are still tied to water for reproduction. These guys are the first group that have completely freed their life history from a need for water so that they can live in places where there is no free water and get by. These guys and the mammals, the amniotes. That word amniote that we use to describe all reptiles, birds, and mammals refers to this amniotic egg, which is a land egg. It's a highly different type of egg from what you find in amphibians. Amphibians lay eggs that are basically like fish eggs that have to be in water. This egg is a land egg, and in fact, amniotes that lay eggs, even ones that live their entire lives in the water, lay the eggs on land. So something like a sea turtle does not lay its eggs in the water, even though it lives its whole life in the water. It still comes on the land to lay the egg. They all have internal fertilization, right, which means that the male puts sperm inside of the female's body. There's no situation where they're releasing sperm into the environment, right? There are ectothermic members, meaning individuals that use ambient temperature, ambient heat to regulate the internal temperature of their bodies. There are some endothermic members. The only modern endothermic reptiles are birds, right? So there are none outside of that group. But as to whether or not there's some maybe extinct reptile groups beyond birds that are endothermic, that's kind of debated. Many of them have 3-chambered hearts. Snakes, lizards, turtles all have 3-chambered hearts. Crocodiles and alligators have 4 chambers. So they have a ventricle with a septum so that oxygen-poor blood's kept entirely on the right side, oxygen-rich on the left side. And then, of course, all birds have 4-chambered hearts. This idea of the protein keratin forming this external layer, that's common only to these guys, right? So, for example, if you look at snake scales, bird feathers, the hair follicles, and the hair that you have, your skin, your nails, you realize this is all homologous to like snake scales, right? Forms hair and skin and nails in you, forms feathers on a bird, and it forms the scales on the feet of a bird, and it also forms the scales on a snake or a lizard or something like that. This waterproofing protein called keratin as an outer covering is really only found within these amniotes. If you look at fish have scales. Those are totally different scales, right? Those are actually bony scales. They're not keratinized scales. Most reptiles, including birds, have 2 temporal fenestra. Temporal fenestra are the holes in the skull that the master muscles pass through so that you can chew. If you have 2, you're said to be diapsid. You'll see turtles are actually anapsid. They don't have any holes. And mammals are the only surviving group of synapsids. If you're synapsid, you have 1 hole in your head. So you only have 1 hole in your head, right? And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. Okay, so here's this amniotic egg, right? There's typically a porous shell that allows for gas exchange, and you have the system of internal membranes. So you have the chorion that lines the shell, you have the amnion that goes around the embryo, it's fluid filled, and then you have the yolk sac and the allantois where waste products are put. I mentioned to you last time that it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination. If you look at this, this would be like a chicken egg, right? If you picture a woman who's pregnant, right, she has an amniotic sac that goes around the embryo as it's developing. When the water breaks, that's the amniotic fluid coming out of the sac, right? This, the yolk sac and the allantois are modified to form a placenta, which is almost, you can kind of imagine that, right? Can't you imagine this forming a placenta that would attach to the uterine wall? This would be then the umbilical cord that would attach. You realize the placenta is part of the baby. When the baby's born, the placenta comes out, right? A non-pregnant woman doesn't have a placenta. So if you just kind of like take away the shell and modify this a little bit, we're amniotes, right? Just because we don't lay eggs doesn't mean we're not amniotes. We basically have this structure. It's just modified for live birth, is what it boils down to. Yeah. There's two cute little amniotes coming out of their amniotic eggs. This shows the anapsid, diapsid, synapsid condition. So here you see the two temporal fenestra that you have like in something like a crocodile. Synapsids, mammals only have a single opening, and anapsids, turtles, is one group that doesn't have any opening. There's kind of like a little cartoon version of it. Should point out too, if you look at these, you notice diapsids have a jaw joint that's set very far back. It's actually between two bones called the articular and the quadrate that I'm going to show you in a second. If you look at a synapsid, the only surviving group of which are mammals, the jaw joint is moved further forward. Y'all just kind of see that? It's between two different bones, the dentary and the squamosal. And that's going to be important in a second because you'll see that the two jaw bones here, the articular and the quadrate, in mammals, because they're not being used as part of the jaw joint, it actually migrated into the ear. All mammals have three inner ear bones. They have a stapes and an incus and malleus, whereas if you look at diapsids, they have only the stapes. That's considered to be one of the hallmark defining characters of mammals, is to have three inner ear bones. Do y'all know what a dimetrodon is? That's called a sail-fin dinosaur sometimes. Can you picture what that is? Like it looks like a, I don't know, a big lizard with a huge sail fin on its back. Can you picture that? They had a bunch of fossil ones up like in the Field Museum in Chicago where I worked. If you look at the head, it looks very much like this. This is obviously like a deer or something, right? But it looks almost like a deer or a dog. This doesn't look like a dinosaur, does it? Really, if you think about it, those aren't dinosaurs, you realize. They're early synapsids. They're not mammals, but they're in this general lineage. Dinosaurs, of course, are diapsids, right? So you look at a dinosaur skull, you'll notice, I mean, you just kind of can instinctively tell that a bird or reptile, if you look at the skull of a bird or reptile, the jaw joint is set very far back compared to where it is in a mammal. Yeah.
Feather? I think that's a horse, y'all.
Or it could be a horse.
Is it a horse?
No,
I don't know.
it's chingosa.
I study mammals. I think it's a deer, but I'm not sure. It's some kind of a grazing animal. How's that? So this shows you the amniotes, right? So if you were to mark characters on these branches, which actually it asks you to do, y'all recognize this? It's here on the practice exam, right? And it asks you to map some of these characters on here. When it asks you like amniotic egg and what else? Keratinized scales. I mean, those are things that would be on this branch right here, right? Leading to the last common ancestor. Maybe let's do that question while we're doing it, so I won't have to do it again since I got the picture right here. So notice that those things would go on here, right? Amniotic egg and keratinized scales. Those are characters that would presumably have been in the last common ancestor for all amniotes, right? There's sort of these two major lineages. Of course, you got turtles up there. Not sure exactly where they go. But then we have the diapsids here and the synapsids. And you'll notice the only surviving synapsids are mammals. If you look in here, we've got some extinct things, right? Like pterosaurs. What would a pterosaur be? Like a big flying dinosaur-like thing, right? Then we have the ornithischian dinosaurs and saurischian dinosaurs. And then we have a plesiosaur and an ichthyosaur, which I imagine some fish-looking saur, right? And then you have, these are sort of the modern reptiles, right, are just turtles. And then Twittarus, that weird little thing with the Rhynchocephalia thing. Squamates would be lizards and snakes down here. And crocodilians up there. So you can see birds are right in the middle here. You all understand why reptiles is problematic without putting birds in? If you delete birds right here, the rest of these together is not monophyletic. You have to add birds in, right? Birds are reptiles. They're completely nested up inside of reptiles. This isn't too hard to accept, right? I mean, have you ever looked at a bird up close? Right? They got little scales all over their feet. Look at them in the eye. Right? Doesn't look like a mammal. Looks like a reptile. It really does. Look at a snake's eye, and then look at a bird's eye. Look at a snake's eye. Look at a bird's eye. You know how, like, when somebody goes and eats rattlesnake for the first time, they go, "What does it taste like?" And they go, "It tastes like chicken." You ever think when you stop by like KFC and pick up a bucket, I'm gonna go home and eat a reptile? They're reptiles, guys. Birds are reptiles. If you think about it, if you really just sort of get in that mindset, it's not much of a stretch. They look like reptiles in a lot of ways. They just have feathers on the outside, but otherwise there's a lot of very reptilian features that birds have. And you'll notice that actually birds are dinosaurs. So not all of the dinosaurs went extinct at the KT boundary, right? I mean, there was one group that came through and radiated at the beginning of the Cenozoic and did a really good job, right? And that's birds. Birds had a massive radiation and made it through. They really are dinosaurs, is what they are from a phylogenetic point of view. Yeah, so let's map a couple of these things on here. So four-chambered hearts. Who has four-chambered hearts up here? Crocodiles and alligators have four-chambered hearts. So do birds, and so do mammals. Everybody else, well, part of the problem is here, we have not the foggiest idea, for example, what a pterosaur has. I don't have a pterosaur heart. I have a skeleton or something, right? I don't have a plesiosaur heart. I don't have an ichthyosaur heart, right? So I don't know what they had. So how are we going to do this? But I know we've got like 3, right? We've got 4 there, and 4 there, and 3 up there, and 4 down here. How are you going to do that? How are you going to map this on here? I'd be tempted to map it. You have to map it at least twice, probably, right? I'd be tempted to map four-chambered heart here on mammals. And I'd be tempted to map it maybe here, because I can put it on just one time. And then the question is, even though I don't really know how many chambers these had, I might be tempted to say that they had four-chambered hearts, because that would be the simplest explanation, right? Because I know I've got 4 in crocodiles, and I know I've got 4 in birds. Either that, or you have to show it here and here. I put this on as an exam question. It was a pain in the rear to grade. Can you all imagine why? Because if somebody put four-chambered heart here, I had to take that. But if somebody put it like here and here, I think that's reasonable too, so I kind of had to take that too. It was really hard to score it, yeah? How about feathers? Where would that go? Right? Some of these guys might have had feathers, I don't know, but this would probably be the safe place to put it. Certainly of the extant things on here, nothing else has feathers besides birds. Epiglottis, I'm going to show you in a second when we do mammals. That's a uniquely mammalian trait, so it would go on mammals, right? How about where would you mark incus and malleus? Those are those 2 inner ear bones. Who has that?
Mammals.
Mammals, so it goes on there. How about endothermy, being regulating a constant high internal body temperature? Again, I don't really know whether some of these had it. Some of them might have, right? They look at like the size of blood vessels going through bone tissue and stuff like that. And a lot of people speculate that there were at least some dinosaurs that were endothermic, were capable of regulating high internal body temperatures. But of the only extant groups up here that have them would be birds and mammals. So I'd be inclined to mark it on this branch and this branch, but maybe if you marked it back here or something, that's not really wrong. Not really sure, right? Exactly. But definitely the endothermy that we find in birds is not the same as the endothermy we find in mammals. How about keratinized scales? We already said that goes back here, right? That's for all amniotes. How about diaphragm? You'll see in a second that that's a character for only who? Mammals, right? That's a uniquely mammalian character. How about amniotic egg would go back here. Single temporal fenestra would be here, right? Synapsids, right? Everybody else is a diapsid or an anapsid. How about powered flight? That you got to map out probably 3 times. There are mammals that have powered flight. What are those? Bats, right? And that's obviously independently derived from the powered flight that we see in birds. And how about this group here? Like a pterodactyl or something flies. So you have like at least 3 different acquisitions of powered flight. Notice how different that is from invertebrates, right? How many invertebrate groups figured out how to fly? Just 1. Presumed a single acquisition of powered flight in invertebrate animals, and that would be for insects, right? But here, within this relatively small group of terrestrial vertebrates, we have probably at least 3 or 4 different acquisitions of powered flight. Okay, good. We already got one of these answered. You all kind of mark those on the branch. So all you had to do on this question was just kind of mark where those things map on this tree, or approximately where they map. The thing is, there's a couple of potentially correct answers on a couple of them. That's why it's a pain to grade, but kind of gives you an idea. Okay, so which one of these amniotes is a synapsid? In other words, has a single temporal fenestra? rattlesnake, a mouse, a flamingo, or a sea turtle? Carrie, do you want to pick an answer? What about a few more of you? Okay, anybody else? Was that it? 13? Okay, I'm going to end it. Is that it? 13? No. Okay, is that it? You're debating whether you change it. Okay, right. That's the only mammal. The others are all reptiles, right? Reptiles are either amniotes or diapsids, not synapses. Okay, so remember we've got the phylum Chordata. Then we've got all these nested subgroups. These are craniids. They all have a head, right? Within craniids, they're vertebrates. The notochord becomes a vertebral column. They're gnathostomes. What does that mean? They have jaws. So not all vertebrates have jaws. What would be a vertebrate without jaws? A hagfish is not actually a vertebrate. It's a craniid, but not a vertebrate because it doesn't have a vertebral column. But it doesn't have jaws either. That's good. So how about who's inside of the vertebrate group would have a vertebral column but wouldn't have jaws? Not hagfish, but what's the other group of jawless fishes? Well, agnathans would be hagfish plus this group, which of course is not monophyletic, so we're not really using the word agnatha. It starts with an L. Lamprey, right? Did somebody say lamprey? Lamprey. That's what my donkey does. These are Stichdians, which means they have what? Bony skeleton, and they have either a lung or something that's derived from a lung. These guys actually have lungs. How about lobed fins? What does that mean? That they have parts of their skeleton that extend beyond the body wall, right? So it's not just like little rays in a fin or something. They actually have major skeletal elements that extend into appendages. They're tetrapods, which means what? They have a, what does tetrapod mean? 4 legs, right? They have basically a pectoral girdle with 2 forelimbs and a pelvic girdle with 2 hind limbs. They're amniotes. You now know that that means that they do what? They have the amniotic egg, right? So they have a land egg. And these are reptiles. So you'll notice here we go. Here's Chelonia, right? These are the 4 extant orders. I'm not showing any extinct stuff. This is a Tuatara, that weird little thing that's in an order by itself. Rhynchocephalia. Squamates, snakes and lizards, and alligator, which would be a crocodilian. So they're the 4 orders, right? Crocodilia, squamates, Chelonia, Rhynchocephalia, and then of course we've got this huge group with 27 historical orders in it of birds. So this should be your image of what constitutes a reptile. Yeah? A really variable group, but they're all diapsids with the exceptions of the turtles and tortoises. That brings us down to mammals. Here we go. Here's the last one. This is a class inside of the phylum Chordata. It's long been recognized as a class. There's about 18 orders, 2 of which are basal, and then the others are kind of all in flux. You'll see that those 2 basal groups are called monotremes, marsupials, and then we have about 16 orders of what we call placental mammals, which, guess what placental mammals all have in common? They have a placenta that connects the little developing baby to the uterine wall of its mother. Monotremes, you'll see, actually there's only 2 lay eggs, right? So that's a little strange. And marsupials do what? They give birth to very, very tiny babies that do what? Develop in a pouch. Yeah, so they're pouch mammals. Okay, so what do mammals all have in common? They're amniotes. Typically the major structures of the amniotic egg would be modified to form a placenta, but that's in most mammals. They have a 4-chambered heart, convergent with the 4-chambered heart in birds. They're endothermic, convergent with the endothermy that you see in birds. They're synapsids, so there's a single temporal fenestra. Not all synapsids are mammals, but all modern synapsids are mammals. This is the only group of synapsids that survives. So something like a sailfin dinosaur, you realize that that's first off not a dinosaur. It is a synapsid, but it's not a mammal, right? It's not a mammal, it's an extinct synapsid. The only modern synapsids, though, are mammals. Here we go. What makes a mammal a mammal? One of the hallmark features that you can find for a mammal is this incus and malleus, right? These inner ear bones. If you have a fossil, you want to know, is this an early synapsid or is this a synapsid that actually qualifies as a mammal? Get the inner ear. If you've got 3 inner ear bones, that is considered to be the definitive indicator that you have a mammal, a real mammal. And I'll show you the origin of those in just a second. Mammary glands, which are modified sweat glands, sudoriferous glands, right? Milk is modified sweat. All mammals produce milk. Not all mammals have little nipples that the babies suckle on, right? So, for example, a platypus, right, just has hair and it sweats milk and the baby kind of licks it off the hair, right? So there's no suckling, but it still makes milk. All mammals make milk. All mammals have body hair. This kind of hair that you have that comes out of a follicle, keratinaceous hair that comes out of a follicle, that's unique to mammals, right? Nobody else has anything like this. We have like hairs on plant leaves, right, that are just extensions of the epidermis. You have little hairs on insect exoskeletons and stuff. But a hair like this that comes out of a follicle, there's nothing like this in any other group of organisms. It's a uniquely mammal feature. This, a fleshy external ear. Fish don't have these. Snakes don't have these. Birds don't have these. This is a mammal trait to have a fleshy external ear like this. Right here in your pharynx, you have a spot where food and air goes through a common pathway and then it divides. The air has to go through the larynx or the glottis, right, down to your trachea and your bronchi and out to your lungs. Food has to go down the esophagus. It's kind of bad to get the food going down the windpipe. That's not where it's supposed to go. So mammals have a little flap that covers over the top of the windpipe when they swallow so that the food is forced down through the esophagus and doesn't get stuck in the glottis. The little flap is called an epiglottis, right? It sits on top of the larynx. Birds do not have that. Snakes do not have that. Turtles do not have that, right? This is a mammal trait. Mammals all have an epiglottis. I don't think there's any exception to that. Even something like a platypus has an epiglottis. But no non-mammal has an epiglottis, so that's a uniquely mammalian feature. Notice these would make very good what? Synapomorphies. These are presumed derived characters on the branch leading to the last common ancestor of all mammals. They define mammals as a group. And there's a lot of them. You can tell there's a bunch I can put right here very easily. The other is a diaphragm, right? This muscle that divides the abdominal from the thoracic cavity partitions the coelom and is used for ventilation, right? Did you guys see, I ended up bringing in some things into the lab yesterday that I forgot to have in there on Tuesday. So if you had lab yesterday, you got a couple extra things. There's a little apparatus that has a membrane on it. You can pull it down. It's got 2 little balloons, right? If you pull it down, right, when you go like this, what does that do? It contracts the diaphragm, which causes it to bow down. That makes the thoracic cavity larger. If the volume increases, the pressure decreases, so your lungs inflate, right? If you relax the diaphragm, it moves up, it goes back into position, and that makes the thoracic cavity smaller, less volume, more pressure, the lungs deflate. You realize you don't have muscles in your lungs. And the cool thing with this little apparatus is just by pulling the membrane below and making the cavity, making the chamber either with more volume or less volume, the balloons inflate and deflate like this. You're not touching the balloons or blowing on the balloons at all. It's all just moving this little membrane and changing the volume and changing the relative pressure, right? No bird has a diaphragm. No reptile has a diaphragm, right? This is a uniquely mammalian system. Birds have these systems of air sacs and stuff. They're all connected to their lungs and everything. It's a totally different system. A lot of snakes actually fill their lungs through movement of intercostal muscles in their ribs and stuff like that. There's nobody else breathes the way we breathe, right? You ever sit there and watch a bird? You watched a bird like pant? Birds don't really go though. Do they? Have you ever seen a bird do that? Just sort of sits there and goes, something like that. Well, the way we breathe is very different from the way any other bird breathes. Okay, so going to these jaw bones, you realize the bones that make up your jaw are actually derived from these skeletal rods that run between gill slits. So if you took something like an egg, gnat and fish, these are the gill slits. And if you look at the 3rd and 4th skeletal rods or gill bars, those are actually what form the bones of the jaws, right? So if you look at these 2 green ones, those are coming from the 3rd skeletal rods. These are coming from the 4th skeletal rods. So if we look at something just a little bit further down the road, right? These you could imagine would have been what, the green ones, right? These would have been the red ones, right? Isn't that right? Am I getting it back? No, that's right. Can you see that? So these bones right here that are making up the jaw are actually derived from skeletal rods between gill slits, right, in an egg-napping fish. Where do you think your teeth come from, you know? At least some of your teeth. Like, I think it's the lower jaw teeth. Believe it or not, they're fish scales. You ever think of your teeth as being fish scales? That's where they're coming from. That's what the evolutionary origin of the are. So if you look here, you'll notice that there's these two bones, right, called the articular and the quadrate. They make up the jaw joint in a diapsid, right? So for example, those two bones are involved in actually forming the joint. If you look at a mammal, the jaw joint is moved further forward, and it's not even between the articular and the quadrate. In fact, you don't even see the articular and the quadrate here. Instead, you'll notice it's between the dentary and the squamosal is actually where the jaw joint forms. When the jaw joint moved forward in synapses, it freed up the articular and the quadrate so that they had nothing to do, and what they did is they migrated into the inner ear. So the incus is actually homologous to the quadrate, and the malleus is homologous to the articular. So mammals all have this kind of an inner ear arrangement where they have a stapes, an incus, and a malleus. They have 3 inner ear bones. If you looked at a bird or any kind of reptile, they're only a stapes. There's only a single inner ear bone. It's kind of wild to think that part of the evolutionary jaw, what the bones that form the jaw joint in something like a crocodile are actually in your ear, the middle part of your ear. Amazing, huh? And this shows you, so this would be the articular and the quadrate here. Those bones would actually be in the inner ear of this animal, right? And the jaw joint is moved between the dentary and the squamosal. Yeah. Okay, here we go with mammals. 18 orders. We went faster with you guys somehow. Monotremes are the egg-laying mammals, right? And marsupials, those are the two sort of basal groups. And then we have a whole bunch of different orders in here of mammals, right? So proboscideans, who would that be? That have a proboscis? Elephants. Sirenians. Siren is like a mermaid, right? Who are the mermaids? Manatees, right? Tubulodentatas, these are like little shrew-like things, if I'm remembering right. A hyracoidea would be hyrax, right? Which is like, kind of looks like some kind of a guinea pig with hooves. A lot of these are African in origin, right? So little golden moles and tinrex, elephant shrews, right? The general name for this group typically are Afrotherians, which means African beasts, right? You probably would not think that like elephants and manatees and hyraxes go together in a group, but there's quite a bit of evidence that these guys actually are each other's closest relatives. This is a long recognized mammalian order. This is Narthrans, and this you'll see is going to be sloths and anteaters and armadillos. Superficially, you might not think there was anything that would cause those to be put together. If you were to look at the vertebrae, there actually is this thing called a Zonarthran process, which is like a little extension on the vertebrae, and it's extremely distinctive. And you see it if you looked at an armadillo, an anteater, and a sloth, if you look at the skeleton side by side, you see the vertebrae look very distinctive and very different from other mammals. These guys, so these are obviously rodents. Lagomorphs would be rabbits and hares, and then primates presumably go here. So, like you and other primates. Flying lemurs and tree shrews. Again, presumably this is coming together. Now, you know, when I took a mammal class at one point, and I always thought that people that study fungi have messed up phylogenies because they're fungi, and it's hard to figure out what's going on. And gee, wouldn't it be nice to work with birds or mammals because they must have all the trees just right. Their trees are just as messed up, you realize, as everybody else. So the closest relative to primates, for example, that's been under a lot of debate. I don't know whether this is really the most current thinking. Some people think that primates are more closely related to chiropterans, which are down here. Anybody idea what chiropterans are? There's about 4,000 mammal species described, only 4,000 total mammals in the world. 1,000 of them are in this one order. Any idea what that is? What order of mammals constitutes 25% of all mammal species? Huh? Bats. Yeah, exactly. So chiropterans are bats. And there's some people, and you might have even guessed that because, of course, you've got the PTER, which you all know means wing, right? So there's a little hint, right? This is where they go. This is that, right? Some people think that those are actually closely related to primates. So this is one phylogeny. This is what I'm going to show it to you. Carnivora, what's that there? Carnivores, so that's primarily two major lineages in there, which are what? Canids and felids, right? So you have basically the dog-like ones and the cat-like ones. So on the cat-like side, you have things like cats and lions and tigers and hyenas. And bears go in here too. Bears, so those are ursids, right? But bears are also in here. Also, there's cervids, things like weasels and raccoons and stuff like that are well, raccoons, I'm not sure exactly where those go in, but there's lots of different types in there. The other major group that are in carnivores that you might not think of as being in carnivores would be pinnipeds. What are those? Seals, right? And sea lions and walrus. You realize sea lions are basically dogs, right? They are. They're dogs with flippers, right? They bark. They're dogs. Set artiodactyls. So artiodactyls are the animals with hooves. They're ungulates, which doesn't really mean anything because hooves are all over the place. They're ungulates or hoofed animals that have their hooves in pairs. They basically come up on these two toes, right? So who has paired hooves like that? Deer, cow, pig, goat, sheep, who else? Gazelle, antelope, right? A whole bunch of them, right? The set part, this is a new twist to this. Normally we would have just talked about artiodactyls. The set part refers to cetaceans, which are a derived group within artiodactyls. Anybody know what a cetacean is? Like dolphins and whales. Dolphins and whales are closely related to things like deer and cows, believe it or not. There's actually an interesting bit of morphological evidence for this. If you ever take on the mammal class and you do like a lab practical, artiodactyls are very easy to recognize based on a very distinctive bone in their heel called an astragalus. So you have a little astragalus in your heel, but most mammals have a single pulley astragalus. They have a double pulley astragalus. It's got like these two little grooves that go over the top of it, and a double pulley astragalus, that's a uniquely artiodactyl feature. So you can recognize an artiodactyl astragalus really easily. So the question would be the really good morphological trait that we would want in order to sort of demonstrate that dolphins and whales are artiodactyls is to see whether or not they have a double pulley astragalus. So we'll just take a dolphin ankle. Have you ever seen dolphin ankle? Dolphins don't have ankles. Dolphins don't have back legs. So here the very telltale feature that we would want in order to sort of try to put dolphins and whales with artiodactyls isn't there. Fortunately, cetaceans, dolphins and whales have an extremely good fossil record. And there are very early precursors to dolphins and whales still have their back legs, and guess what? They have a double pulley astragalus. They have this very distinctive bone that really supports this argument that they're closely related to artiodactyls, not to mention that all the molecular phylogeny is really not that way. You're probably sitting there thinking, wow, what on earth could the intermediate between a deer and a whale, what could that possibly even look like? How could you have that? Hippos are artiodactyls. And if you've ever seen hippos, like in the wild, they're in the water all the time. In fact, when you go to Africa, they'll tell you the most dangerous animal there is a hippo. If you get between a hippo and water, they'll kill you. Because they sunburn really bad and they have to be in water. They actually call underwater. It sounds kind of like a whale. Have you ever heard hippos calling underwater? They're very kind of whale-like. And yet they come out at night and they forage around in vegetation. Unfortunately, hippos are not the closest artiodactyl relatives to cetaceans. So all of the similarities that you see between a hippo and a cetacean are actually convergent. It's kind of like Selaginella being heterosporous or something. Selaginella is not closely related to seed plant, so it's a convergent type of heterospory. But if you want to try to imagine what the precursor to a seed plant might have looked like, you can imagine Selaginella might be something like what it would have been like. If you want to try to imagine what the precursor to a cetacean would be like, you can look at a hippo. It's convergent, so you have to keep that in mind, right? But at the same time, a hippo, kind of like a whale. in a lot of ways, right? Yeah.
I found a really big, huge, like whale's inner ear bone. I don't know if that's like
Does it have a incus and malleus?
it's like it kind of curves in. It's like a
Oh, like the cochlear part of it.
yeah. It's like the it almost seems like the I don't know. I guess it's a whale's inner ear bone. Though.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's cool. Do you have this thing?
Yeah, I had it at my house. It's in my box.
Is it big?
Yeah. Well, it's like
Like too big to break?
No,
Be interesting.
no, it's
Okay.
not that big at all. I can bring it in.
That'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, it's really cool.
What do you think of it? Our last lap. I'm not sure I've ever seen a whale's inner ear bone.
Yeah.
Okay, perissodactyl, so these are the guys with paired hooves plus cetaceans. Perissodactyl are the guys that didn't come up on these two, they came up on this one. So who's that? Horses and rhinos. Rhinos are on these three, right? So rhinos and horses. Chiropterans are bats. Eulycotiphalans is a little group of like moles. And then this thing called a pangolin, which is actually a carnivore. It looks kind of like an armadillo, but it's within the group carnivore. It's also in there. Okay, so you want to look at them real fast? So we've got a couple questions here. So which of the following is not unique to mammals? Diaphragm, stapes, epiglottis, or do you think all three of those are unique to Neopteri?
What's the stages?
Stapes is one of the inner ear bones. Okay, that's everybody, right? 13? Okay, good. So stapes is not, right? Diapsids have a stapes too. Okay, so here are the two monotremes, right? Platypus and an echidna. Here's a little baby one coming out of an egg. These guys lay eggs. Both Australian, right? Presumably there was much more monotreme diversity historically. These are the only two that have left. Platypus has a little poison spur on its feet, so as kind of cute and cuddly as they look, kind of a weird looking animal, right? It has this bill like a duck and doesn't have any teeth. Has this little poison spur, very, very dense fur though. I remember when I was in Sydney, if you go to the aquarium, the Sydney aquarium, they have a big tank with these guys all swimming around. I was kind of like, wow, that's amazing, because I'd never seen like live ones before.
Are they friendly?
Well, they have poison spurs. I don't know how friendly they'd be. I think that I don't know whether it would kill you, but certainly not something you'd want to be stabbed by. We have stuffed ones upstairs that, again, I brought out on Wednesday. You know, I'm not big on dead animals, right? In the lab, dead vertebrate animals. But I brought them out just because they're real, and I didn't know whether people had ever seen one. And they're kind of moth-eaten, and they're kind of falling apart and kind of gruesome looking. But if you look carefully at the foot that's falling off of the platypus, you actually see that it has a little poison spur on it. It doesn't look like something you'd want to get gouged with. Okay, these are all marsupials, right? So these are all guys that have little babies that are very small, and of course they're amniotes, right? So there's actually, they have the same little membranes, there's no shell, but like a little baby kangaroo or whatever, when it's coming out of its mother's urogenital opening, it pushes this little allantois out, and then it crawls up the hairs and goes into the pouch where there's the teats, and it suckles in there and grows into a little joey or whatever in there. And so there's a lot of diversity in these. Obviously the diversity is Southern Hemisphere, primarily in Australia, and they've occupied all these different niches. So there's like marsupial wolves and marsupial tigers and all these different niches that placental mammals have occupied in northern radiations. You have these kind of parallel species within marsupials, these parallel body forms. And so this is a Tasmanian devil, and this is a kangaroo or wallaby, and this is a wombat, this is a koala, not a koala bear, right? It's not bears. And this is an example of a North American marsupial possum, right? There's not many North American marsupials. In fact, really that's the only one, right? Okay, so if we look at this group right here, so if you're trying to kind of put that together in your mind, it'd be things like hedgehog, and this is a aardvark, right? Something as big as a pig that burrows in tunnels underground. Kind of really strange animal. And proboscideans, right? Sirenians. Here's a hyrax. Isn't that a weird looking little thing? These were running around in Tsavo in Kenya when I was there. They have hooves. They have toenails that look like I don't know, like a deer's toenails or something. Very strange little guy. So you probably would not think that these went together, but there's actually a very strong support for lumping at least these three together in this Afrotherian group. It says in Moat, if you go over and look at the manatee, it says something like the closest relative of the manatee is an elephant or something like that. It says it there. And manatees, notice, are really different from, I think a lot of people think that they're probably related to like pinnipeds or something, right? To something like a seal or a sea lion or something like that. And yet you notice manatees don't fare very well at all in cold weather, right? They really don't have the blubber layers that you have in seals, and they're herbivorous. They're not carnivorous the way that seals and sea lions are. Everything you see here that's a similarity between a manatee and something like a walrus or a sea lion, it's really all convergent, right? It's really not related to those at all. Okay, if we look at Xenarthrans here, this single order of mammals, armadillos, which of course we still have armadillos in North America. They don't kind of technically really belong here. And anteaters, true anteaters, right? And sloths. And of course, about 3 million years ago, when you realize that North and South America weren't always connected, right? About 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama closed. And then we have what we call the Great American Biotic Interchange, which is when everybody that was south came running north, everybody that was north came running south, right? The animals that came north at the end of the Ice Age, major parts of them got totally wiped out. So you realize up until about 20,000 years ago, they had like giant sloths running around, giant sloths. They had a skeletal one at the Field Museum. It's like twice as tall as this. Well, no, but he was up against a tree, right? And he's like, well, probably 3 times taller than this roof. I mean, these things are huge, like bigger than any bear you could imagine. It's hard for me to imagine those just like, I don't know, wandering the plains of Kansas or something, you know? Huge mastodons, you know, all these really kind of interesting animals that we had running around North America that got wiped out probably about 18, 20,000 years ago when the last ice age ended. And there's a lot of different competing hypotheses as to whether people came in. There's a thing called the Clovis hypothesis, that people kind of came in and hunted them to extinction. There's lots of different ideas. It's not really...
What about the Glyptodon?
And Glyptodon, which is basically an armadillo-like thing that's as big as like a VW bug, right? And had this huge like mace-like structure on its tail and everything. I mean, how cool would that be to have those like running around today, right? They were here, right, running around not that long ago. But really, these guys are really sort of the only ones that survived. I don't think there's any sloths left in North America. I don't think there's any of this type of anteater left in North America. These are the ones I was saying, though, if you looked at a skeleton of each one of these, you'd see these vertebrae, and they have this very distinctive little structure or projection on the vertebrae. Every single vertebrae has what's called a Xenarthran process, and it really kind of unites these. You might not think of these as a natural group.
Yes, sir. Are they able to like classify like the mammoths and like the mastodons? Like even though they have so much like, fossil evidence, are they still able to like do a tree with those? Even though they're like not alive today, but yet they still have fossil remains. Like,
yeah, they do. Right. Oh, people that work with fossils do phylogenies. They do phylogenetics. They do it all with morphology, though. So every little groove on every little bone and every little, all different aspects.
They can't find like molecular data inside the fossil remains?
It depends. If it's something that's relatively recent, sometimes they can get ancient DNA out. Very often, though, the DNA you could get out of a fossil is very highly degraded, so it's difficult to be able to amplify a particular marker that you're using. And with teeth, sometimes they can. I mean, I have no experience doing it at all, so I'm not a good person to ask. There are examples of people getting DNA out of fossils that are, I don't think, as soon as you're talking about like fossils that are like in the tens of millions of years old, you're kind of out of luck, I think, by then. I don't think that they typically are able to get DNA out of those, not usable.